The outdated and artificial thesis, which is dominant in Brazilian thought and recurrent in part of Brazil's geopolitical tradition, has deeply entered the psychology of Brazilians. Is it the one about occupying the interior? Or that demographic voids would be a vulnerability, and that by occupying the empty interior, this would automatically strengthen national power? However, this doesn't hold up when confronted with contemporary territorial development theory and with historical evidence compared to other countries that had empty spaces in their interiors. In fact, holding on to this way of thinking even today proves how, in terms of geopolitics, Brazilians still have a 19th century mindset, not updating themselves, not being ambitious, and simply making strategic mistakes. The settlement is at the border. The contingent factor. It's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition to increase economic, logistical, or security power. What the documents and policies themselves show is a more specific and less automatic logic. It says that territorial integration through infrastructure to create connectivity and state capacity would often have objectives of national integration and of security and control. By separating organic occupation, which is the one that exists naturally due to accessibility, so to speak, driven by economic or logistical demand and private returns that are self-sustaining, from artificial occupation, which is the one induced by ideological or supposedly strategic state decisions with low economic suitability and requiring subsidies and control, the comparison of cases suggests a consistent pattern. Lasting, permanent results depend on economic fundamentals, institutions, and logistics, and not simply filling in the empty spaces on the map. The mention of Brasilia as a successful example of artificial occupation shows an inability to read reality. Brasilia exists only because the whole country needs to support the city with colossal taxes. In other words, it's not a productive region that supports itself, but rather a parasitic complex that exists by appropriating the production of the rest of the country. But before getting into that detail, let me explain the difference between organic settlement and artificial settlement properly, so you can understand why things are the way they are and why the obsession with occupying empty spaces just for the sake of occupying is something utterly foolish. The idea that occupying empty spaces automatically strengthens national power is an extremely overstated causal claim. In other words, what I mean is that one thing will lead to another, but in a very exaggerated way. It's really stretching it to say that one thing is related to the other. I say this because it suggests that the act of populating would by itself be a sufficient mechanism for generating power. In other words, for generating economic activity, logistics, and security. However, the literature on spatial development proves that prosperity and integration tend to follow density, reduction of economic distances, and connectivity, and not a distribution of the population across the territory. Organic settlement is territorial expansion driven by incentives that arise from people acting of their own free will, seeking private economic returns, such as competitive agriculture, mining, trade, or other things, or from logistical routes that reduce transportation costs, or even from concrete strategic needs, such as a high-value logistical corridor with the ability to become self-financing over time. The presence of the state may even exist, whether in organizing land titles or in financing infrastructure to support this population. But the sustaining mechanism, the force that keeps this standing, is voluntary demand and income. Artificial settlement, on the other hand, is top-down settlement driven by demographic and territorial targets and an ideological rationale to integrate, conquer, or revitalize an area. This often happens in areas with low economic potential and high transportation costs, which then require continuous government subsidies, coercion or institutional control, and huge public investments. This defense of settling the Brazilian interior appears as a response to an old idea, the idea of fragile integration due to low population density in certain areas, and the anxiety about security involving borders and modernization. This mindset comes in formulations about the emptiness of the backlands and the vitalization or effective incorporation of still uninhabited territory. In Continental Projection of Brazil by Mario Travassos, he focuses a lot on communications and territorial axes as a political translation of geographic trends. He is concerned with the geostrategic and continental aspect, with integration through circulation. In General Geopolitics and of Brazil by Everardo Beckenhauser, he associates the revitalization and settlement of border and territorial areas with military functions and the need to administer regions with a very low population density. In the military lineage after World War II and at the Superior War College, Goberido Couto e Silva and Carlos de Meira Matos connect the idea of moving inland to the concept of Brazil as a power, along with integration and security. Meira Matos, in this case, envisions an Amazon that is integrated and forever Brazilian, and explicitly links Amazonian policy to development and settlement, considering the weakness of its population as a vulnerability. In other words, most of the Brazilian geopolitical repertoire insists on this costly and unnecessary inward-looking vision, which by focusing Brazil's priorities inward ends up resulting in an isolated, timid and unambitious foreign policy. In other words, the very historical elite of Brazilian geopolitics ended up creating a model of thought that limits Brazil. And it places Brazil as eternally being a supporting actor, self-reclusive, which shows the quality of Brazilian geopoliticians. However, there's an exception. Others exist, but the main one worth noting is Teresinha de Castro. She is often associated in the official tradition with maritime and Antarctic geopolitical debates, especially because of the theory of confrontation applied to Antarctica. She is mentioned alongside lawyer de Carvalho as the author of this sectoral variation where the priority, in fact, should be Brazil's pursuit of supremacy in the South Atlantic. What separates successful inland occupation from unsuccessful ones is the simultaneous presence of four conditions that, when absent, turn this occupation into a paper project or a predatory frontier. The first is the economic condition, which involves the existence of plausible and realistic production chains, affordable prices, and compatible productivity. In the case of the Indonesian transmigration program, which failed to relieve demographic pressure in Java, audits pointed out flaws in the agricultural model, such as soil types, settlers' experience, extension services, or the preference for jobs outside farming, reducing the economic return even though the physical targets were more or less met. The second is the logistical condition. Brazil has a curious case, which is exemplified by the Trans-Amazonian Highway, which clearly illustrates the artificiality of Brazilian projects. First, the infrastructure is created with the goal of attracting people, and only afterwards do they see whether people will actually live there or not. In an organic situation, the creation of infrastructure comes after people arrive in order to meet that demand. In other words, the Brazilian state, inflated by a mix of vanity, stupidity, and lack of respect for public resources, first creates the supply in the hope of then seeing if it will generate demand. And since the physics of the universe doesn't work that way, we only have two consequences, and both show that these policies are failures. Either this infrastructure ends up abandoned because no one ended up using it, and the state realizes it failed, so it's lost money that will never be recovered and could have been better used somewhere more useful. Or the state insists on maintaining this infrastructure with expenses that just keep increasing and piling up without ever giving any return. Because look, the logistical condition needs to provide continuous access to markets and maintenance of roads so that they can later sustain themselves on their own. Studies on colonization show that poorly maintained roads isolate communities during the rainy seasons, degrading economic viability and further increasing administrative costs. The third one is the institutional condition. That is titling coordination between agencies, between minimum public services, and the ability to correct the course. Audits on artificial demographic expansion projects by the World Bank highlight failures in monitoring, evaluation, and institutional coordination in settlement projects, which made learning and course correction difficult. And finally, the ecological and sanitary condition, which is the adaptation to the environment and the management of risks such as diseases, endemics, or soil management, for example. The study by the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation notes that health conditions and endemic diseases can be the Achilles heel of Amazonian colonization and describes the imposition of production packages with mistakes due to lack of local knowledge. In other words, some bureaucrat in a big capital city in the southeast or in Brasilia, having a brilliant idea of how the world should be, insists on going against the forces of nature. Usually there's some public manager who thinks that engineering and technology are there to solve this, ignoring the fact that money isn't infinite, and who usually thinks that technologies are magical forces, where an engineer will, for next to nothing, mysteriously solve nature's problems. This classic doctrine of we have to occupy the interior, which associates emptiness with vulnerability and imagines settlement as an almost mechanical response, is outdated today. But it was already outdated in the 1950s when they had the idea to create Brasilia. Territorial economics, even before that time, favored density and integration, not dispersion. The transformations related to density, which are cities, to the reduction of economic distance and integration, suggest that spatially unequal growth can coexist with inclusion through integration policies instead of seeking balance through forced dispersion. That's why global urbanization is the dominant macro trend. The data and syntheses from the United Nations prove a structural increase in urbanization and in the number of cities, putting pressure on the failure of policies that tend to de-urbanize by decree. Now guys, just a quick message. Do you know why I can make this kind of video more focused on hardcore geopolitics, dealing with heavier, more technical, denser topics for a slightly more elite audience like you who are watching this? Because of the members. More than 90% of the channel's revenue comes from the members. The members make sure this channel can exist, since if it depended only on views, this channel would have ended a long time ago. So, consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, not only do you ensure that I can continue with this creative freedom, academic freedom, to bring deeper topics. What's more, you'll also get access to several exclusive series for members in return, like the geopolitical history of the United States, the geopolitics of the Mongol Empire, the military history of China, intelligence and counterintelligence course, Machiavelli course applied to modern geopolitics, which I'm teaching right now. So you get a lot of benefits besides making sure that the Geopolitical Mundial channel keeps existing. The idea that we need a capital inland because on the coast it would be vulnerable to attacks ignores the fact that the main world powers actually have their capitals close to the coast. Especially with occupation wars becoming increasingly rare after World War II and with the expansion of intercontinental ballistic missiles that can hit any target around planet Earth. And especially with the rise of nuclear weapons, it doesn't matter where your capital is, it will be hit. In case of war, if it has to be destroyed, it will be. If you want to protect your capital, you build a strong navy to protect your coastline, or you develop nuclear weapons to deter aggressors. But you definitely don't use the dumb and cowardly argument of moving it to the middle of nowhere. Besides, the idea that empty interiors are, as some Brazilian geopoliticians have commented, an invitation to invasion is something that simply has no historical basis. The main wars of occupation and conflict happened exactly where countries had more people living on both sides of the border, not in empty places. Besides, empty spaces like the southern United States, Xinjiang in China, or the central part of Russia are actually used as testing grounds for new weapons and sensitive technologies, and are not a vulnerability for these countries. So it wouldn't make sense for this to be a vulnerability for Brazil. Real powers use empty spaces as opportunities, and not like Brazil did out of anti-strategic and costly egocentrism. And speaking of costly, we have another example as nefarious and immoral as Brasilia, which is the Manaus Free Trade Zone. It is proof that occupying the Amazon through a tax-subsidized industrial enclave and treating this as a major geopolitical strategy is, at the very least, confusing subsidized urban presence with real territorial strengthening. The problem is that decades after Decree Law 288 of 1967, what we see is not the occupation of the Amazon, but the consolidation of a large urban industrial enclave in Manaus. This is not the inland spread of Amazonian settlement, it's metropolitan hyperconcentration. The simplistic and shallow geopolitical thesis developed in Brazil would say that more people, more industry, more government means more territorial control. But the free trade zone didn't spread strengthened economic density throughout the Amazon. It concentrated income, jobs, and infrastructure in a specific hub that depends on permanent incentives. And the cost of this for the rest of the Brazilian people spread across the country is very high. The Federal Court of Accounts, based on data from the Federal Revenue Service, shows that the Manaus Free Trade Zone and free trade areas were among the largest tax expenditures of the federal government, with 26.5 billion in 2022. In the 2025 annual budget bill, only the Manaus Free Trade Zone item appears with 5.3 billion. 5.34 billion reais in tax expenditures on import taxes, in addition to other benefits distributed across different taxes. A study by IPEA, published in Economic Research and Planning, examining the years from 2002 to 2014, concluded that the tax expenditures of the Manaus Free Trade Zone did not increase the gross value added, that is, the GDP, income, or even the revenue of the state of Amazonas. The positive effects appeared mainly in population, employment, and an increase in the proportion of low-educated workers. And on top of that, the Manaus Free Trade Zone remains an obstacle, a very heavy anchor that makes Brazil's reindustrialization difficult. In other words, Brazil is paying a very high price for a very foolish idea of wanting to occupy the interior. And there is an even deeper conceptual point. Classic Brazilian military geopolitics has often confused occupation with power. But real territorial power doesn't come from people scattered randomly, nor from an artificial tax island or a capital forcibly imposed in the interior of the country. It comes from the combination of a viable economy, functional logistics, defense, and market integration, infrastructure, and persistent state capacity. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Share this video with everyone you know to help the Geopolitica Mundial channel keep growing. It may not seem like it, but your support is very important since YouTube practically sweeps the World Geopolitics channel under the rug. So your support is really important when you share. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Take a look later at the videos tab so you can see other videos also related to more classic geopolitics, more in-depth geopolitics, which is the focus of the channel. Alright? Thank you very much everyone. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next video.